Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to the Yale Club this morning for Innovations for Poverty Action's Evidence Matters event. My name is Amy Shaw. I'm the Director of Development at IPA. Innovations for Poverty Action was established in 2002 by Dean Carlin, an economist who's now at Northwestern University. Our mission is to discover and promote effective solutions to global poverty problems. And what that means is that we do research, often randomized controlled trials, to figure out what works best in poverty alleviation and international development. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Sebastian, and we'll be hearing later from Rodrigo Canales from the Yale School of Management on a kind of a deep dive on some work that we're doing in Mexico. So enjoy the program. Thank you for coming, and over to you, Sebastian. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Amy, for the introduction. As Amy mentioned, I'm Sebastian. I'm the director of the Peace and Recovery Program. I've been with IPA for 4 years now. I've been the director of the Peace and Recovery Program for the past year. Before that, I was the director of our country office in Colombia. And today I'm going to be speaking about a project which relates to both of the jobs I've had with IPA, because it's a project related to our Peace and Recovery portfolio that we implemented when I was in Colombia. Before diving into it, though, I thought I'd start by mentioning why we are working in peace and recovery, because it's a question I often get, and sometimes I'm asked, oh, so IPA is no longer just poverty, it's doing something else. I actually think the work that we're doing in peace and recovery is very related to poverty. And the way I've thought about this is through the work of Amartya Sen, who some of you may be more familiar than others, is an Indian economist who in the 1980s came up with a capability approach, which is a way of thinking about poverty that is different from the traditional way of thinking about poverty, not just about income, but thinking about the capabilities people have, capabilities to wake up in the morning, to go to work, to move around by oneself, and including the capability to feel at peace, to feel safe. And I think the work that we're doing is within that realm. And at IPA, we've done so much for other capabilities, such as nutrition, financial health, health in general. But we haven't done as much around peace and security. And this is the work that we're beginning to do a lot of more now with the Peace and Recovery Program. Globally, this is very important in the sense that although right now 17% of the poor live in fragile and conflict-afflicted places, by 2030 that number is expected to rise to 46%. So we're seeing a concentration in conflict-afflicted places, and understanding the causes and the consequences of violence is therefore, I think, particularly important to the study of poverty. In Latin America and the Caribbean specifically, as you may be aware, we have the highest homicide rate in the world, with 1.5 million people having been killed in the 2000s. Even though we have 9% of the world population, we account for 33% of the homicides around the world. And if you have looked at the polls every time before elections, crime, safety, security is always number one on top of all of the other concerns, such as unemployment and economic well-being. So in the Peace and Recovery Program, our goal is to create evidence and informed policy on reducing violence and promoting peace, which is what we'll be speaking about today, but also reducing fragility in general and preventing, coping with, and recovering from crisis. And there we're doing quite a bit of work with refugee situations and forced displacement. So to jump into the project, this project took place in Bogotá, the city I and another 8 million people call home. It's a project that we implemented with researchers Chris Blastman, who's at the University of Chicago and is also the academic lead for the Peace and Recovery Program. Daniel Ortega, who's at CAF, Santiago Tobon, who's a postdoc at University of Chicago and at IPA with our Colombia office, and Don Green, who is actually here with us, who's at Columbia University and is joining us and will hopefully help me answer questions if you have any hard questions, although I know he has to leave a little bit early. And he was kind enough to tell me that if he leaves early, it's not because he didn't like what I presented, but because he has to go. So this happened in Bogotá in 2015, right before the mayoral elections. As I said, polls in general show that safety is one of the major concerns before elections, and this is exactly what we saw in 2015. 59% of Bogotá's citizens mentioned that they felt insecure right before the elections. And Enrique Peñalosa became mayor. Elected October 2015, his mandate started January 2016. And in October, this is from El Tiempo, the major newspaper, when he had to mention his first priorities for his first 100 days, number one was security. So this was the area that he wanted to prioritize. However, it's not very clear what one should do if one wants to focus on security in Bogotá. Because there are many constraints that the city has. One of them is that the city does not control the number of police officers on the ground. So even though the police reports to the mayor's office in Colombia, in this case in Bogotá, the police is a national police, and where the policemen are distributed is a national decision, and it's not the mayor's decision. So even though the mayor can tell the police what they're supposed to do, staffing decisions are not really up to the mayor. And Bogotá is a city that has a modest police force. And as you can see, it has 239 police per 100,000 residents, which is less than the Colombian average. It's less than similarly sized US cities. So it's a city that doesn't have as many policemen as the mayor thought they should have. And comparatively, it has less than other cities. But that was not in the hands of the mayor. And the other thing to know about crime in Bogotá is that it's very highly concentrated. And this is the case in many cities around the world. In Bogotá, when we looked at the figures of crime from 2012 to 2015, 25% of all crimes, and actually all homicides, were concentrated in 2% of the city blocks. Nevertheless, those blocks got 10% of patrol time. So they were getting more patrol time than the average block, but they were still getting 10% for being the ones that are having 25% of the crimes. So what did Mayor Peñalosa do? The first thing he did was name Daniel Mejia, who's the man here at the center of the picture, as his Secretary of Security. Daniel Mejia was an economist at Universidad de los Andes back then, and he had been working with the city of Medellin, helping them do something called hotspot policing. And hotspot policing is what it sounds. It's sending police to the hotspots. And it's a strategy that in the US has been evaluated numerous times and had been considered in generally to work to reduce crime. And this was a strategy that Daniel Mejia was interested in testing in Bogotá. He was also interested in testing a second policy, which was municipal cleanups. And the idea was that if there are criminals who go to a city corner and they see something like what you're seeing in those pictures, and those are pictures that we collected in our baseline, where there's trash everywhere, but also non-artistic graffiti, where maybe the lights don't work, that criminal will feel, you know what, this is a place where I can do whatever it is I'm here to do. Well, if you show up to a clean place, you might think, well, this is a place where the state is present. Maybe this is not a place where I should do what I came here to do, and maybe I'll go elsewhere. So he wanted to test these two things. So together with the researchers, we developed an intervention to do that. Then intervention was choosing 1,919 hotspots. These were chosen based on the figures from 2012 to 2015, but also checking in with the local police and making sure they agreed. And when we checked in with the local police, some of them said, you know what, these hotspots that appear here are not really hotspots. They just happen to be coming up in your records for whatever reason. And in other cases, they said, you know what, this area, even though is not in your files, is a hotspot, but crime goes unreported, so you should include it. So somehow we were able to, through these discussions with the administrative data, narrow down on these 1,919 spots. And then divide them up, not equally, but divide them up in 4 different categories. One type of hotspot would get hotspot policing, doubling the police. So on average, police spent 92 minutes in Bogotá in all the other spots. In these ones that were assigned to hotspot policing, police spent 169 minutes. And we know that because police in Bogotá have GPS units that report their location every 30 seconds. So we actually know whether compliance with the treatment is high or not with the police. Some other areas got municipal services. They got cleaning of non-artistic graffiti, fixing of public lighting, and increased trash pickup. Some of them got both, and some of them got neither. And the ones that got neither got business as usual. No one was told you can't police this area or anything like that. They were just told, they were not told anything about it. And this is, of course, a small percentage of the spots in Bogotá, so they were treated like any other city block. What was very innovative about this study, and this is thanks to the work that Don Green did here, was the way that the hotspots in the city were selected. It was not just simply those 4 as I described, but the control ones, we distinguished between the ones that were 250 meters away, 500 meters away, and the ones that were further than 500 meters away. And what this allows you to do, and you can sort of see it here, the red spot is a hotspot. The dark green ones are the ones that are within the 250 meter mark. Then there's the light green ones, which are between 250 and 500. And then the next ones are the blue ones. right? So what that allows you to do is measure displacement, measure whether crime is actually being reduced or whether it's being displaced, whether it's moving around the corner. And this is something that distinguished the study from the others that had been done in the US and was answering a very important question, which is whether crime is actually being reduced or whether doing these place-based interventions is actually just moving crime around. So February 2016, the mayor's second month as mayor, the intervention starts and goes on for 8 months. And at the end of 2016, we had the results. And the results are, I think, very interesting. The first thing is each intervention individually led to a minor decrease in reported crimes. But when you look at the displacement factor, it looks like it didn't reduce crime in the city at all. So this is in contrast to some of the other findings in other parts of the world and tells us something about whether this works. The other thing is combining both interventions led to a large decrease in reported crimes, as you can see here, 57%. But again, due to the spillovers around, we know that the overall impact could not have been more than 1 or 2%. So it's possible that this was positive, but even if it was positive, the impact was not very high. And the other thing that we see in the data is that property crime seems to be displaced rather than violent crime. And this makes some sense if you think about a criminal who has an intention, who's there to steal a motorcycle, steal a car. If you show up and you see more police, for example, you might say, I'm not going to do this here, but you go to the next block and police are not there, so you can do it there. But violent crime in Bogotá, a lot of it comes up due to bar brawls. It tends to not be planned. And as a result, you can imagine if there's police there, people either act differently, or when they notice that the police is there, or when the police notice that this is happening, they may jump in and they may stop the crime. So these are complicated findings. It's not an easy yes, it works, or no, it doesn't. But it's food for thought that the municipal government is now using to redefine how they define hotspots and where they are doing this intervention. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rodrigo Canales, professor at Yale School of Management, who will speak with you about a study in Mexico.
Thank you, Sebastian. Good morning, everyone. Very nice to meet you. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk about a very large project that we have going on in Mexico right now that's called Building Effective, Resilient, and Trusted Police Forces in Mexico. It has a bunch of partners. It's funded by the Department of State through the Merida Initiative, and it's implemented with our partners IPA, who have been just wonderful partners. So this project has two very large components. One component is focusing on the question of organizational design. What should a police organization look like? The basic research design is there are about 2,000 police organizations in Mexico with enormous variance in their size, their organizational design, their organizational trajectory, their history, their quality, right? And obviously there's enormous variance in the results that they achieve. And so we're using that variance to gain empirical traction to learn what works for designing police organizations. And so it has two components as a project. One is we're doing 10 in-depth case studies of attempts at police reform, like genuine, sincere attempts to reform a police organization in different parts of Mexico. And obviously we're matching these cases to make sure that we learn as much as possible from each additional case. And then we have a massive quantitative effort where we've built a data set where we have the organizational characteristics of all police organizations in the country and how they have been changing in time. And that allows us to see whether changes in the design of a police organization translate to better results in what people care about, right? For example, what kinds of businesses are created, what kinds of consumer habits we observe in these locations, et cetera. And so again, the idea is to see whether adding or removing organizational practices actually translates to better results for those police organizations. The second large component of our project is in partnership with the Mexico City Police, and it's on this question of how do we build trust between police and citizens? One of the reasons why the results in hotspot policing, for example, tend to shift a lot is because the reality is that I don't care how large your police organization is, the police cannot be everywhere all the time. And so what happens with hotspot policing is you put police officers there, and of course, crime doesn't happen there, but you can't have police officers everywhere all the time. So without a citizenship that trusts the police and that works together with the police, you cannot lower crime, right? And so building trust with citizens is a true priority for any police organization. And it's actually a puzzle that the Mexico City Police has been facing for a number of years. And so what we're doing, you can think of this is the blue thing that you see is Mexico City as the legal entity, not the metropolitan area, but just the legal entity of Mexico City. And you can think of Mexico City as being quite similar to Manhattan on every dimension, including the size of the police force. And so when I'm talking about the work that we're doing with them, you can imagine that we're working with the New York City Police, but people look a little bit shorter, a little bit older, but it's a very similar police force on other dimensions, including the operational model that they follow, right? And the way they divide the operations in Mexico City is, again, they have about 40,000 police officers, and they've divided the city into 5 zones, 15 regions, 75 sectors, and 850 quadrants, following a CompStat model, which is exactly what they use here in New York City. And so again, the puzzle for them was, how do we go about building trust with citizens? And so we have a 3-year research agreement between Yale University and the Mexico City government. And this project, again, itself has also 2 components. I'm going to speak very briefly about the data component because I'm going to focus a little bit more on the field experiment that we're conducting with them. On the data component, because it's a CompStat model, they gather an enormous amount of data, kind of like what you saw that Sebastian was presenting, like very granular crime data kind of at the point level and exactly at what time of the day the crime happened and exactly where. And so we were giving access to all of their data between 2012 and 2018. And the goal there is to use those data to analyze what patterns of policing, police officer characteristics, police officer teams, configurations of patrols seem to translate to increases or decreases in trust between the police and citizens at a very localized level, right? And so to give you an idea for the data component, and I'll tell you why I'm talking about this in a second. So the Mexico City Police had a bunch of data sets on all criminal activity, again, geolocated, every call for service that they've received, every patrol assignment, so we know when each police officer has been assigned to patrol which areas of the city, right? We thus know the configuration of teams and who the commanders were and how they move around. We know the career trajectories of individual police officers. We know when they joined the force, we know their backgrounds, we know when they've been promoted, when they've been sanctioned, we know all these things. And we have some measures of citizen perception that are not great, but we have some of them. And just to give you an idea, like even though it's true that the police have all these data, it's also true that each of these data sets was sitting in a different part of the organization with different sort of characteristics of the data, with different levels of quality, different periodicity in the measurements. It was a mess. And so one of the things that the partnership with IPA allowed us to do is we had a data analyst. This is a very talented data analyst. It took him a year to clean, standardize, sort of put together and integrate the data into one single data set, where now we have kind of imagine the map of Mexico City with all these different layers of data kind of put on top of it. And so now we can do some pretty sophisticated analyses of what's happening in each place. But without that year of work, we couldn't have been able to do it. And the reason why I'm talking about this is that one of the things that this research project has allowed us to do is we wrote this up as code, and we gave it back to the police and said, like, you need to be able to do this all the time. You need to be able to integrate all these data and analyze them systematically, because there's a lot of things that you're not seeing just because you're not pulling together all the data that you already have. You're just not doing that. And so we worked with them to sort of give them the code back, and now they've integrated, and we're also training them on how to begin doing those analyses. Give you a quick example of the types of analysis that become possible. For this question of trust, we thought, well, what's a thermometer of whether the people are trusting the police or not? Do they call the police when they're in trouble? Right? It's kind of like the first thermometer. And what we found that we think is really interesting is when you look at a baseline measure of calling behavior, for example, when there's an accident, If you look at calling behavior across the city when there's an accident, on average, behavior looks very similar across the city, and on average, when there's an accident, there's about 2 calls per accident everywhere in the city. So somebody got run over, about 2 people on average will call to report that somebody got run over. When you look at property crime, in contrast, when you look at, for example, somebody went into a business and robbed the business, there are areas of the city for which there are about 4 calls per incident. There are areas of the city where there are 15 incidents per call. If you have an area of a city where there are 15 incidents of somebody robbing a business and nobody's calling the police, you have a problem, right? And so that comes through very cleanly in the data, and what we're doing is looking again at whether changes in police behavior translate to changes in the extent to which people are calling the police and trying to extract lessons from that. So that's the data component. And now I'm going to jump into the experimental component. Again, this is the mindset of trust, right? And so we have kind of 3 layers or 3 different initiatives in the field experiments. The one that's taken up most of our energy and time is a field experiment on training police officers in how to have productive interactions with citizens. I'm going to talk more about that. But then we also have 2 other initiatives that we're exploring. One is an adaptation of the focus deterrence model, which is one that is designed to deactivate spirals of homicide that happens in kind of hotspots in different cities. And then we also are redesigning their ComStat model to include measures for citizen engagement and not just for control of violence and for control of crime. So let me tell you a little bit about the field experiment that we're doing. So again, without trust, police cannot do their work. And so the question of how to build citizen trust is critical for any police organization. But trust is not something that you can build directly. Trust is a consequence, it's kind of a secondary consequence of whether citizens perceive an institution to be legitimate. And legitimacy, we've known for decades, comes from kind of 2 components. One is people's perception of the ends, so people's perceptions of whether an institution is achieving the results that it's supposed to achieve. The second, and actually the most important component, is people's perception of whether an institution is acting legitimately, whether the means through which they achieve the results are perceived to be fair and are perceived to be legitimate. And so the perception of the means through which an institution achieves its results is kind of the most important component of legitimacy. And research has shown for a long time that what determines people's perception of the means through which an institution kind of interacts with citizens, it's called procedural justice. When an institution behaves with the principles of procedural justice, people come out of that interaction feeling that this institution is legitimate and therefore this institution can be trusted. And basically the 4 principles of procedural justice are voice, neutrality, respect, and reliability, right? And so if an institution gives citizens voice, if an institution shows neutrality, meaning it's clear that the institution is not behaving differently with different people based on what they look like, their preferences, their appearances, their characteristics, then that shows neutrality, respectful treatment, obviously, and then reliability, which is explaining the reasons why the institution is making the choices that it's making. So if a police officer pulls you over, the police officer tells you exactly why you're being pulled over, tells you exactly what's going to happen next, and explains to you the process, right? And so if these 4 things happen, and by the way, in that sequence, then regardless of the type of interaction you have, you're going to leave that interaction feeling like this institution can be trusted. Again, this has been shown in the lab and in other settings hundreds of times. The question is, how do we train police officers to behave this way with citizens in every interaction that they have? And so the field experiment that we have with Mexico City is training police officers and mid-level commanders on principles of procedural justice and police legitimacy. I'm going to walk you through the theory of change because that'll help you understand why we set up the experiment the way we did. We know that procedural justice, if you do it, it works. It's been shown in the lab 100 times. It's been shown by observing police officers who naturally, just because of who they are, they follow procedural justice. You can show that translates to citizens trusting them. But for a training in procedural justice to work, 3 things have to happen. The police officers need to understand the concepts and agree with them, right? They have to be like, oh yeah, I get it, and I agree with it. But that's not enough. They also have to internalize it. They have to believe it in their hearts that procedural justice should be done, and they have to kind of truly internalize those concepts. And then obviously they have to actually change their behavior. They have to use those concepts when they're interacting with citizens. And while what has been shown before is that if you teach procedural justice to police officers, they comprehend it, but it's never been shown whether they actually internalize it and whether they change their behavior. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with this project. So what we did is we randomized 60 sectors into 30 sectors that are in treatment and 30 sectors that are in the control. We randomized 2,000 police officers that are matched in characteristics. 1,000 of them went to treatment, 1,000 of them went to control. And we do this training with police officers on the main themes of procedural justice, understanding why trust is a critical principle of operational efficacy. It's not something that it's a nice thing to have. Like, without trust, you can't do your job. And we work a lot with them to explain them and to have them understand why trust is such a critical component. We obviously walk them through the 4 principles of procedural justice and what it looks like on the day-to-day work of police officers and what kinds of tools they can use. It's a very practical training, so they have to practice a lot while they're in the training. And we obviously have a reflection on why it's difficult. We recognize that it's very difficult for police officers to do this because their interactions with citizens are difficult, and so we have a reflection about that. And so for evaluation, again, we wanted to make sure that these 3 things, we wanted to test whether these 3 things were happening. So for comprehension, it's very simple. You do pre and post surveys with treatment and police and control police officers. But it was much more challenging to think about how do we measure internalization of the concepts and how do we measure changes in behavior. So for internalization, what we did is we designed a photojournal methodology that I'm going to explain to you in a second. So we have, well, I'll tell you in a second. So these are the surveys. But the one that we think is the most innovative and the most exciting in terms of the data that we're collecting is this question of whether police officers are changing how they think about policing. So the photojournal methodology is we give them a camera, our treatment and the police officers, we give them a camera and we say, during the next 5 days, take pictures of what it means to you to be a police officer. They don't know that this ask is related to the training they received a couple of months ago. It comes from a very different channel. They think it's just a survey on policing attitudes. And so they go out for 5 days, they come back with their pictures, and we sit down with them, we do an in-depth interview so they can tell us the story behind each of these pictures, right? It's incredibly powerful data, so I'm going to walk you through 1 day of one police officer in Mexico City. This is the type of data we get. This is, they were assigned to guard the entrance to a school. And so this is a picture, he sent, like, this police officer sent 3 or 4 pictures of his partner posing with kids. And you can see in the pictures that the kids are genuinely thrilled that the police officer asked if he wanted to or she wanted to be in a picture. Like, the kids are beaming. And the story tells the police officer tells a very touching story of how he feels and how important it is for him to have a chance to interact with kids once in a while, because he says, I want to be the police officer that these kids see. That's who I want to be. Right. Next call for service of the day, so this happened at about 8 a.m. At about 11 a.m., he gets a call for service. It's a picture that I'm blocking out because it's a 14-year-old kid who got his face blown off. And it's a kid who the police officer knew. It's a kid whose parents were absent. The police officer tried many times to kind of steer this kid out of trouble. And when the police officer tells the story and describes the name and the story of this kid and how worried he had been about him, this kid got convinced that day to deal drugs for someone just to get earn some money. He was dealing drugs for the wrong gang in the wrong place, and he got killed. And the police officer says, me lo mataron, which in Spanish is like, they took him away from me. Like, he's taking ownership over this kid who's a 14-year-old boy. So for the police officers, like, imagine the emotional journey. He was connecting with these kids in the morning, then his kid got killed. Next call for service is this one, which is a picture of a car being towed. The police officer got a call for service because a neighbor said, like, a car's blocking my entrance. I don't know where the driver is. Can you please help me? Police officer gets there. They can't find the driver, so they call a tow truck. As the tow truck is taking the car away, finally the driver appears. And the driver is unhinged. Starts immediately, doesn't ask anything, starts immediately yelling at the police officer. Like, of course, you're just all corrupt. All you want to do is take money away from me. You should be chasing the bad guys and not going after the good guys like me, like just completely unhinged and just like enormous amount of verbal abuse to the police officer. Police officer's like, I'm just doing my job. It's like a neighbor called because you're blocking their entrance. And to this police officer's credit, he says, listen, this citizen is being an idiot, but I have to be the adult in this conversation, and I have to be the professional one. But how do I not punch this guy? How do I not punch him? He has no idea what I've just been through. And he's in the wrong here, and he's acting like a moron. But I can't do anything about that because I have to be the professional in this interaction. Right? Next call for service. During the time when we gave them the camera for this exercise, a police officer was killed in action. And so this is a picture of the funeral, and you can see the top brass is dressed in their formal uniforms. We thought the story was going to be about how risky police work was. The police officer only gave one caption for this picture, which is, if only they cared as much about us when we're alive as when we're dead. So this is the journey of one day in the life of one police officer in Mexico, just a random day. But what the data allow us to also do is, for example, on these kinds of interactions, to see what kinds of emotions are the police officers explaining. And what we're finding is that our police officers who we trained, the positive sides of policing are very similar for everyone, but on the negative sides, the police officers who we trained are 4 times less likely to express negative emotions and especially express negative behaviors in reaction to citizens in frictious interactions, which is exactly what we want, right? When you build trust is not when things are going great, but when there's a problem. You want to make sure that you behave professionally when there's a problem. And so we're very kind of encouraged by the data that we're seeing from this photojournal methodology. I'm going to stop now because I'm sure you have questions, and we want to make sure that we have time for questions and answers.
What are the results you have?
Well, the thing is, we are in the middle of data collection, right? And so we're doing midline surveys, for example, on understanding of the concepts, and we're conducting it right now. And so we don't know. I'm blind to everybody's blind to the results while we're raising them, and so we don't know.
How sure are you that you'll be able to continue with the new government?
Fortunately, we've presented what we're doing to the new government, and they loved it. They really appreciated the work that we've been doing. They're very excited about it. The new mayor of Mexico City is a very data-driven person, thankfully. And so they really want to keep the work moving. And thankfully, that's by design. We signed a 3-year contract that by design straddled administrations. And by design, it was signed not between Rodrigo and the chief of police, but between Yale University and the Mexico City government. Because we wanted to increase the cost of a mayor coming in and saying, like, well, I'm canceling the contract that is designed to build trust between citizens and the police. And it's like, well, that's not a very wise move. But the mayor is genuinely interested in, the new mayor is genuinely interested in continuing the work.
What would happen if you focused, instead of on the patrol operation, on detectives and understanding what's required for detectives to do their work well and efficiently, certainly with respect to data gathering and pattern identification?
Yeah. So I think that's a fascinating question. In Colombia, we didn't look at that. But there are other evaluations that have looked at the criminal process. And there was actually a reform in Colombia that took place, and the impact of it was evaluated. It was not done by us, but I have the information, and I'd be happy to share it with you.
So let me tell you why we explicitly chose not to prioritize that. So when you think about the justice system, the way we're thinking about it, it has 3 large components. You can imagine that it's a 3-legged stool, right? You have the prevention in crime, and so eliminating the root causes why people engage in criminal behavior in the first place, and like social services, that kind of thing. You have policing, like preventive policing, like the stuff that we've been doing. And then you have exactly what you're talking about, which is the prosecution of crime, the delivery of justice. And the 3 legs are equally important. This is a stool that can't stand on 1 or 2. It needs the 3. And so the reason why we focus on preventive police is because it's a precondition without which the other 2 cannot function. If you don't have a strong police force, then you can't deliver social services because you don't control the territory. Right? And so we've seen it in Mexico over and over again, and many places in Latin America. You can design the best social service that you want, but if you don't control the territory, you can't deliver it reliably. Right? And so you need to have control of what's happening in a place, right? And that's exactly the job of the police. On the detectives that you're talking about, a couple of things. Number one, the first responders are always police officers, right? The people who arrive at the scene first, the people who have to guard the evidence, like all these things are police officers first, like they're first responders on the system. But second, without the trust of the neighbors and of the citizens, you're not going to get the types of information that are absolutely critical to solve crimes. That labor of building trust with citizens, it's not done by the detectives. It has to be done by the police. Those are the folks who actually develop that kind of trust in the system that then allows people to say like, oh, I do want to give you information. If people don't trust the police and the police that they see are the patrol guys, they're not going to give information to detectives. And so the precondition for all the other things to work are the police, and that's why we decided to focus on them first. It's not that I don't agree with you that detective work is critical. If we don't if we don't solve this first, we don't have a hope of doing the other two. And so that's why we prioritize that one. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's a sequencing issue, the way we thought about it.
I was wondering if in your research, did you differentiate the type of crimes you were looking at versus looking at which crimes could be displaced versus actually which ones were reduced, or did you encompass a big definition of crimes?
As we looked at crimes, we didn't have a pre-specified idea as to which crimes would be displaced or not. We allowed the data to tell us what we found. And what we did see is that certain crimes seem to be displaced, while others seem to not be as displaced. So violent crime, which in general in Colombia was homicide and sexual assault, seem to not be displaced, seems to actually be reduced. While property crime, such as theft of motorcycles, cars, burglaries at homes, seems to be displaced. However, I say seems to because those results are not statistically significant. So we see a shift in that way, but we cannot definitely say that this is what we're seeing, unfortunately, because of this issue. So.
And there's a little wrinkle that I would add to what we are all seeing in Mexico. I agree 100% with what Sebastian said. And in homicides, I would add a wrinkle, which is when you separate homicides that are of they just got in a brawl after a bar. Those, if you do more policing, those will go away. But the homicides that have a name and a last name, those don't go away. And so the homicides that are like they were going after someone, those don't go away with more.
I was very intrigued by the last picture you showed where the officer, captioned it, if only they cared about us as much when we were alive as when we're dead. And I was wondering, is there any metric to show, what their own trust is within their own system?
Very important question. So a lot of the data that we gather in our surveys, we don't just ask them about whether they engage in trustworthy behavior. We ask them whether they trust their commanders, whether they feel that their commanders behave in procedurally fair ways. We ask them whether they trust citizens. The answer to your question is no, they don't. If you ask a police officer here, do you trust citizens? Most police officers will say no, I can't trust citizens. And that's especially true in Latin America, right? They say citizens are the ones who come in and try to bribe me, and they come in and they behave like idiots, and of course I don't trust them. And they don't feel like they can trust their commanders. One of the most interesting results that we have found in the surveys that we have been able to analyze is that when we train police officers, their perception of citizens improves a little bit, their perception of their peers improves, their perception of the police work improves a lot, their perception of their commanders worsens. Precisely because their perception of police work improves, they say oh yeah, this is what policing is about, that is not what my commander is doing. And so that's why it was so important for us to design procedural justice training for commanders as well. And so part of the intervention is also designing a treatment arm for commanders and explaining to them why behaving in procedurally fair ways inside of the institution is so critical, right?
As part of the design, do you have any component to measure the citizens' perception beyond the calls that you receive per incident?
Right. Yes. We do have an instrument that is measuring citizen trust. So the answer is yes. It's going to be very hard for us to be able to, given that we only trained 1,000 police officers at this stage, it's not going to show up in the data. We know for a fact, right? Because the 95% of citizens don't interact with police officers on a regular basis. They just don't. And so it would be really, really hard to pick up on changes in perception even a year after this intervention. That's why we wanted to focus on police officer behavior. It has been shown many times that when police officers behave in procedurally fair ways, that increases citizen trust. That's been shown a gazillion times. But we are measuring it just to get a sense for how it varies within the city and to interact that with our police officer behavior and their take-up of the training. Because we believe that it's much easier for a police officer to pick up on the training when he or she's working in an area where citizens are kind of behave well towards the police. It's probably much harder to pick up the training when you're in an area where the citizens hate the police. And so we want to pick up on that.
I would add that in Bogotá, we sought to look for that as well, to look at whether this was changing the trust that citizens feel or their perceptions of the police. We thought that we may be able to pick up on it since policing was doubled in those areas. And in the areas where there were cleanups, we thought that they would be noticeable cleanups. We did a very large survey. I think it was the largest survey done in Bogotá for sure. In 2016, it was 24,000 people. Very large because we also wanted to pick up on self-reported crime. And crime is rare enough that if you want to be able to pick up on it statistically, you need a huge sample size. So we implemented this very large 24,000 person survey where in each one of the spots around the city, we did 10 surveys and we asked people not only about the crime that they had perceived, but also about changes in the way that they had seen their block, about trust in the police, trust in the state. We did not see any change in trust or in perceptions of the state.
And my interpretation of these results that we see in different research projects is that the cycle for destroying trust is very quick. The cycle for building trust is pretty slow. And we have to be okay with that. And we have to be disciplined about understanding that the cycle for building trust through perceptions is gonna take a long time. The cycle for diffusing trust is immediate. You just need to see one image, right?
The study in Bogotá, what has the city been doing since then, and have there been additional studies involved?
Yeah, so we shared the results with the city at the end of 2016, and then in January 2017, we had a public event in Bogotá with the police, the mayor's office, and we invited the press to show them the results. Since then, immediately what the police told us they were doing is they were changing their definition of hotspots. They only wanted to focus on violent crime because those are the ones that you could see a perception with, well, not the ones on property crime. So their interpretation was, immediate interpretation was we wrongly defined what a hotspot is. Let's define it correctly and let's use the same strategy. So we know that that's what the police immediately did. Since then, the Secretary of Security in Bogotá, he has done a bunch of other evaluations. So there's an evaluation of community policing. They then were about to install a lot of cameras and lights around the city. So they started an evaluation of putting security cameras around the city as well. And those two are still ongoing. Since then, the Secretary of Security has actually left, and he's now in charge of strategy at the Attorney General's office in Colombia. So he's now beginning impact evaluations on the investigative side of crime. So I think what has started is a lot of new impact evaluations that are happening in this sector in Colombia. And in terms of how the police will continue to do this, I'm not sure. I know that they've been looking into using predictive policing or trying to use some type of algorithm to redefine the hotspots continuously and being sort of smarter about how hotspots are defined. Perhaps a hotspot at night is not the same as a hotspot during the day. So they've been sort of digging into the data and trying to see if there's smarter ways to do this in the future.
Thank you.